Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Phantom. If you're looking to relax and fall asleep, you've come to the perfect spot. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me what time it is for you. Now, close your eyes and relax. I walked into the house, a place I hadn't stepped foot in for years, but the moment I did, everything from my childhood rushed back. My name is James. I'm 38 years old. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years since I last lived here, yet the feeling of this place hasn't faded. I was just 18 when I left, kicked out by my parents when things at home fell apart. The argument felt so trivial at the time, but looking back, it was just a catalyst, the beginning of the end for me here. But I'm not thinking about that now. I'm not here to dig up old wounds, not here to remember the things I left behind. But there's something about this house that makes it impossible to ignore. As soon as I walked through the door, a flood of memories I didn't even know I had came rushing back. The smell of the old wooden floors, the creak of the stairs as I moved up them, all of it. It was as if the house had been waiting for me to return. Every corner of it felt familiar, yet unsettling. Time had done its work, and the house now felt older, tired. The walls had absorbed too many years of silence, and the floorboards had grown weaker under the weight of so many forgotten footsteps. I didn't want to be here. The last time I'd walked out of this house, I thought I was leaving everything behind. My parents, the arguments, the dark memories. But somehow, here I was, standing in the entryway like nothing had changed. The rooms looked the same, but they didn't feel the same. There was an unfamiliar chill in the air, an uneasy weight that pressed down on me. The walls seemed to close in as I moved deeper into the house. I could almost hear my younger self running through these halls, laughing and shouting, oblivious to what the future held. But now the house was different. I was different. I felt something shift inside me as I walked further in, like I was stepping into a past that didn't belong to me anymore. I couldn't tell if it was the house itself that had changed or if it was me, but the atmosphere had a weight to it that I couldn't shake. As I reached the old living room, the space that had once felt like home, I paused. The room was empty now, void of the life it once held. The furniture was gone, and the fireplace, once a source of warmth, now looked cold and forgotten. It felt as if the house had been waiting for something to happen, something to stir it from its slumber. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I had the distinct feeling that something was about to unfold, something I couldn't quite explain. I turned to my right and found myself in the hallway that led to the kitchen, the one place in the house that had always been a source of comfort. The worn tile floor, the yellowed cabinets, and the rusted refrigerator, all these things had been constant during my childhood. Yet now, everything felt distant. The old family photographs that had once decorated the walls were gone, leaving behind nothing but empty nails and faded memories. The sink, once cluttered with dishes after a long day, now sat untouched, like the house itself had been abandoned by time. I walked through the kitchen, the cold, empty space almost suffocating me as I moved forward. Each step I took felt heavier, like I was trudging through mud. And yet, I couldn't turn back. It was as though I was compelled to keep going, pulled towards something I didn't yet understand. I walked down the hallway leading to the stairs. The old wooden staircase creaked under my weight as I slowly ascended, each step echoing through the quiet house. The second floor had always felt like a place of refuge, a sanctuary away from the chaos that sometimes brewed downstairs. My bedroom, tucked away at the far end of the hallway, had been my private space. It was where I could escape, where I could be alone with my thoughts, my music, my books. Now it felt distant, almost foreign. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the hallway in front of me, the dim light filtering in from the windows casting long shadows on the floor. The silence was deafening. It was a silence I hadn't realized I'd been avoiding for years, a silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. I glanced down the hallway, my gaze falling on the door at the end. My bedroom, the one place I had tried to forget. The room where I spent countless nights wondering what life would be like after I left. It was the room where I had finally walked out, not just from the house, but from my past. The night my parents kicked me out was a night that changed everything. It wasn't a dramatic fight. It wasn't a heated argument with raised voices and angry words. It was a quiet betrayal. My parents, exhausted by the endless tension between us, had made their decision. I was no longer welcome. The words they spoke that night still echoed in my mind. "You need to leave, James. It's time." And so I did. I packed my things, grabbed what I could, and walked out the door, leaving behind everything that had once been mine. The house, the family, the memories. I thought it would be easy, that walking away would make everything better. But it didn't. Now, standing in the hallway, I couldn't help but wonder if that night had been the beginning of something more. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if it were waiting for me to remember something important. Something I had long forgotten. I walked toward the bedroom door, the creaking floorboards beneath me the only sound breaking the silence. As I reached for the doorknob, I felt an unfamiliar chill on the back of my neck. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my move. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, then slowly turned. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. As I stepped into the room, the familiar scent of old books and dust hit me immediately. It wasn't overwhelming, but it felt like a punch to the gut, like the air itself was filled with everything I had left behind. My old room, once a place of comfort and safety, now seemed completely different. The walls were bare, the shelves empty. Where my posters had once hung, there were only faint outlines, reminders of what used to be. I walked further into the room, letting my hand brush against the worn wooden desk where I had spent so many late nights studying or scribbling in my notebook. The chair creaked under my weight as I pulled it out, sitting down for a moment. It wasn't just nostalgia that hit me, but a strange, unsettling feeling. It was almost as if the house itself was trying to tell me something, or maybe it was trying to make me feel something I had been avoiding for years. My gaze drifted to the window across from me. The view had changed, I realized. The old oak tree that used to stand proudly in the yard was gone, cut down long ago when the neighbors had moved in and complained about the roots damaging their driveway. In its place stood a small, overgrown shrub. It looked out of place, just like I felt in the room. But even as I stared out the window, the chill in the air thickened. It was as though something was wrong, something I couldn't place. I shook my head, trying to push away the unease that was creeping in. I didn't want to be here, yet here I was, alone in the house that had once been mine, feeling like an outsider in my own past. A sound broke the silence, a low creak coming from the hallway. I froze. I told myself it was just the house settling, the same way it always did. But there was something about it that didn't sit right. The house had never creaked like that before. My heart began to race as I stood up, slowly moving toward the door. I had told myself I wasn't going to let my mind get the best of me, that I wasn't going to let the memories haunt me. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't explain. The hallway outside was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the floor like fingers reaching for me. I stepped out of my old room, hesitating for a second, then continued toward the staircase at the end of the hallway. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should have, as if the house itself was listening to my every move. I reached the top of the stairs, my eyes darting around the upper floor. The old bathroom where I used to spend hours staring at myself in the mirror was just down the hall, its door slightly ajar. I avoided looking at it, afraid that if I did, I would see something I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I turned my attention to the door at the end of the hall, the door to my parents' room. It had always been locked when I was younger, and the idea of entering it now felt wrong. But there was a part of me, a part that I didn't want to acknowledge, that felt like I needed to go in. I approached the door cautiously, my hand hovering over the knob. The house felt colder now, as if it were waiting for me to make a decision. I turned the knob slowly, feeling the smooth metal under my fingers. The curtains drawn tightly shut against the light. A soft squeak. The only sound was the quiet hum of the old ceiling fan. The air inside was stale, untouched for years. Nothing had changed. The bed was still there, the same floral comforter that had always been there, now faded with time. But there was something about the room, something that didn't sit right. The silence felt too heavy, too oppressive. It was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. I stepped further into the room, feeling the weight of the space pressing down on me. The room was still familiar, yet so completely foreign. My parents' belongings were gone, replaced with dust and cobwebs. There was no sign of life here, just emptiness. I walked over to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains to reveal the overgrown backyard outside. The yard had changed, too. Where there had once been a well-kept garden, now there was only neglect. The grass had grown wild, and the once pristine flower beds were choked with weeds. It was as though everything in the house had been abandoned, left to fall apart. I looked back at the room, at the bed where my parents had once slept. The room felt too quiet, too still. But as I stood there, I could have sworn I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flitting just outside the window, too fast for me to make sense of. I turned sharply, heart racing. There was nothing there, just the empty yard, the wind moving the branches of the trees. My breath was shallow as I tried to calm myself down. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But even as I told myself that, a cold sweat began to form on my forehead. Something wasn't right. I wasn't just imagining it. The house, this place that had once been a refuge, felt like it was alive, like it was aware of me in a way that made me feel unwelcome. I couldn't stay here much longer. I had to get out. But just as I was about to turn and leave the room, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound ringing through the house like a warning. The slam of the door echoed in my ears, too loud in the silence that followed. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned to face it, staring at the wooden door as though it might spring to life. I reached for the handle, pulling it in an attempt to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to claw at me, my mind racing through all the possibilities of why it wouldn't open. I yanked harder. Nothing. It was as if the door had been sealed shut by some unseen force. A chill spread through my body and I backed away from the door, my feet shuffling across the old hardwood floor. This wasn't normal. It was just a house, right? But the longer I stood there, the more it felt like something else entirely, like it wasn't just a place but something that was watching, waiting. I turned away from the door and looked around the room, my breath shaky as I tried to steady myself. There was a sense of something lurking in the corners of the room. I hadn't seen it before, but it was there now, like a presence that had always been hidden in the shadows. The dust in the room seemed to move slightly, stirred by something I couldn't quite grasp. I had to get out. The thought was clear, sharp. The door wasn't going to open on its own, and I wasn't about to stay in here any longer than I had to. I moved quickly across the room, my footsteps sounding far too loud in the silence, my mind already focused on the stairs. But just as I reached the door, another sound stopped me. A soft creak coming from somewhere behind me. I froze. The room felt colder and the shadows seemed to stretch further than they had before, pulling towards me like tendrils of smoke. I slowly turned around, half expecting to see something, anything, in the corner of the room. But the room was still empty, just the same old bed and furniture that had been there when I entered. Yet it didn't feel empty. Not anymore. A flash of movement caught my eye, and I spun to face the window. For a brief second, I thought I saw someone standing there, their face pressed against the glass. But as quickly as the image had appeared, it was gone. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned forward, pressing my palms against the cool window pane. The backyard was dark, shrouded in shadows, but nothing moved. Nothing was there. I wiped my hand across the glass, trying to clear my mind of the image I had just seen, but the unease didn't fade. I stepped away from the window, my legs shaky as I tried to focus on the task at hand. I needed to get out of here. I had come for a reason, but that reason felt less important by the second. All I could think about now was leaving, putting as much distance between myself and this house as possible. As I turned back toward the door, I heard a faint whisper. It was so quiet that I almost thought I imagined it, but it was there, like a breath on the wind. It didn't come from the door or the window, but somewhere deeper in the house, somewhere I couldn't see. My name. James. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But the whisper lingered in the air, a strange pressure that seemed to press against my chest. I knew I had to leave. I knew I couldn't stay here, but every instinct told me to move, to run, and yet my feet remained frozen to the floor. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what I might find if I left or what would happen if I stayed. The room felt alive, and I could feel the house pressing in around me, its walls seemingly closing in. The air felt thick, as though it was trying to smother me, making it harder to breathe. I reached for the door handle again, desperate, but once again it wouldn't budge. My panic surged, my mind racing as I tried to force the door open. It felt like the house itself was holding me in place, not allowing me to escape. I could hear my breath, harsh and ragged in the silence, my fingers trembling as I gripped the door handle tighter. The whisper came again, this time louder. James. I jerked away from the door, heart pounding in my chest. The voice was closer now, almost as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. I backed away, my pulse racing as I frantically searched the room for an exit, for anything that might let me out. But there was nothing. There was nowhere to go. I didn't know how much time passed, but eventually I stumbled back into the hallway. The door behind me was still shut tight, and I felt a strange sense of dread fill my chest. The house felt darker now, the shadows longer, more menacing. My hands shook as I reached for the banister to steady myself. The silence was suffocating, but there was something else in the air, something that made my skin crawl. It felt like I was no longer alone in this house, like something or someone was watching me. I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to leave. I moved quickly down the hallway, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the stillness. The stairs loomed ahead, and I took the first step down, my heart pounding harder with each move. The moment I stepped onto the first floor, I felt it. The air was heavier here, the weight of the house more suffocating than ever. I looked around, trying to steady my breathing. There were no more whispers, no more strange creaks, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. The house seemed to pulse with a strange, unseen presence, its walls pressing in on me. I could feel the very air thick with tension. I had to get out. But as I reached for the front door, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the hallway. The door was locked. It wouldn't open. The whispers started again. The air grew colder as I stood there, my hand frozen on the doorknob, unable to pull it open. The whispers intensified, echoing in my ears. They weren't just words anymore. They were like a chorus of voices, low and unintelligible, murmuring all around me. It felt like they were coming from within the walls themselves, the sound surrounding me, suffocating me. I tried again to turn the knob, my palms slick with sweat as I gripped it tighter. But it wouldn't budge. No matter how much I twisted or pulled, the door remained locked. A chill ran down my spine and I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath was shallow, my mind racing for an explanation, any explanation of what was happening. This couldn't be real. There had to be a logical reason for all of this, right? But the more I looked around, the less sense it made. The house felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, as though it had its own presence. It was like it was watching me, judging me, waiting for me to make my next move. I could feel the weight of it in every corner of the room, the walls pressing in with an almost suffocating pressure. I turned away from the door and scanned the hallway. The flickering light overhead cast long shadows that danced like living things. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around. I glanced back at the front door again. It was the only way out. I had to get through it. But every time I tried, the whispers seemed to get louder, more insistent, filling my head with their constant murmur. It felt like the house was holding me captive, keeping me trapped within its walls. I forced myself to move, to push past the panic clawing at my chest. There had to be another way out. Maybe another door, another window, anything that would let me escape. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing far too loudly in the oppressive silence. Each creak of the floorboards beneath me sent a jolt of anxiety through my body. I passed rooms, empty rooms, but none of them seemed right. They were cold, abandoned. The house was like a mausoleum, frozen in time, with everything locked away in shadows. The whispers had stopped for a moment, and in the silence I thought I heard something else. A soft sound, almost like footsteps, but there was no one there. I froze, listening intently, trying to make sense of the noise. It wasn't in my head. I was sure of it. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I didn't. I couldn't. Every fiber of my being was telling me to get out, but the house held me in its grip, as though it was drawing me deeper into its twisted maze. The footsteps were getting closer now, moving toward me, and my blood ran cold. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one. Just the hallway, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The silence had returned, but it was worse now, more oppressive. I wasn't alone. I felt it again, the weight of unseen eyes on my back, watching my every move. The presence in the house was real, and it was aware of me. It wasn't just some haunted house. It was something more. Something far darker, more sinister. I forced my feet to move again, my body heavy with fear. The door. I needed to get to the door. I turned back toward the entrance, my eyes darting around the room. But as I approached the door, the lock turned on its own. I could hear it click as the mechanism released. The door was open. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door as if it might slam shut again before I had the chance to escape. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a deafening silence. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my move. I grabbed the handle and pushed the door open, stepping into the night. The cool air hit me like a shock to the system, and I took a deep breath, trying to clear the fog in my mind. The sounds of the house faded behind me, but the weight of what had just happened still hung heavily in the air. I stood on the porch, looking back at the house. The windows were dark, lifeless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still inside, watching, waiting. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing: the house wasn't done with me yet. I stumbled down the porch steps, my heart pounding in my chest as I glanced over my shoulder at the house. It was still standing there, looming in the distance like a dark sentinel. The cold air felt like a brief relief, but the unease in my stomach only grew stronger as I walked further away from it. My footsteps echoed in the empty street, the silence pressing in on me. I didn't know where I was going or what I was hoping to find, but I couldn't stay there, not after what had just happened. I kept walking, my feet moving almost on their own. The further I got, the more the unease seemed to settle in, the more I felt like I had made a mistake by leaving. It didn't feel right, not leaving that house behind. It wasn't over, I knew that much. Whatever was in there, it wasn't done with me. I could still hear the whispers in the back of my mind, faint but persistent. At first, I thought they were just echoes of my fear, but now I wasn't so sure. Every time the wind shifted or a shadow moved out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling. The street was empty, not a single car in sight, just rows of houses that all looked the same. They felt distant, lifeless, like the world had emptied out. Or maybe it was just me, maybe it was all in my head. But I didn't care, I couldn't care. I had to get away from that house. I made my way down the street, not knowing where it would lead, but unable to stop. My legs were starting to ache, but I pushed forward, not wanting to stop for fear that something would catch up to me. I could almost feel it behind me, creeping closer, the weight of the house still heavy on my shoulders. I glanced over my shoulder again. The house was still there, barely visible in the distance, but I was sure it hadn't moved. It was like it was waiting for me, and somehow I knew that it would always be there. It wasn't a place I could just leave behind, no matter how far I walked. I turned a corner, finding myself in a quiet, unfamiliar part of town. The houses here were older, more run down, like the life had been drained from them long ago. There were no lights on, no signs of life. It felt like a ghost town, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one alive here. I stopped in front of one of the houses and looked up at it. It was a 2-story home, its windows dark and empty like it had been abandoned for years. But something about it felt familiar. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like I had seen this house before. The same dark windows, the same eerie stillness. My gut twisted and I took a step back, suddenly uncertain of everything around me. My heart was pounding and the whispers were getting louder again, echoing in my mind, twisting my thoughts. I had to leave. I had to keep moving. But as I turned away from the house, I felt something change in the air. It was like the world had shifted, and I was no longer alone. There was a presence here, something out of sight but very real. I could feel it. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the air, even though it hadn't been cold a moment ago. My feet froze to the ground as I turned back to face the house, my eyes scanning the dark windows. And that's when I saw it. A figure, a shadow, barely visible in the window but unmistakable. It was tall, standing perfectly still, like it was waiting for me to notice. Its outline was indistinct, a shape that seemed to shift with the darkness, but I could feel its presence. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, but it felt like it was watching me, aware of my every move. The longer I stared at it, the more my mind screamed for me to turn away, to run, to get as far as I could from this place. But I couldn't, I was frozen. And then just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The window was empty again, the dark void inside the house now just a hollow space. I took a step back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get away from this place. But I couldn't make myself move. It was like something was holding me here, keeping me in place. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my mind until I could hardly think straight. I turned away from the house, my feet moving on their own, carrying me down the street with no direction in mind. The fear was too much, and the only thing I could do was keep walking, as if somehow, putting more distance between me and the house would make it all go away. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't over. The moment I stepped into the hallway, the air changed, heavy with something unspoken. The wooden floor creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing longer than it should have. Then a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from somewhere deeper in the house, faint, barely more than a whisper of movement, but it was there. Tap, 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 like fingers drumming against wood. I swallowed hard. Hello, silence. Then a voice spoke. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said. The words were hushed, almost gentle, but they sent a chill down my spine. I turned sharply, my pulse hammering in my ears. Who said that? No answer. I scanned the hallway, my breath catching. Nothing but shadows, nothing but silence. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. I took a step forward and the tapping started again, faster this time. Tap, 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 coming from the end of the hallway. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around to leave to get out before a sharp knock, loud, right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. My breath hitched. The front door, it was shut, but I hadn't closed it. I took a shaky step back, my body tense. Then the voice spoke again. "Go," the voice said, a whisper directly in my ear. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. "Who are you?" The house didn't answer. The silence stretched, pressing in from all sides. Then the knocking returned. But this time it wasn't behind me. It was inside the house. I turned toward the noise, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I had to keep moving. I stepped forward, each footfall feeling heavier than the last. My fingers brushed against the wall as I made my way down the hallway. The tapping had stopped, replaced by something worse. Breathing. Shallow, uneven, coming from just beyond the doorway ahead of me. I froze. My chest tightened. It wasn't my breath. It wasn't my imagination. I forced myself to step closer, peering into the room. It was the dining room just as I remembered it, except for one thing. The chair at the far end of the table was pulled back, like someone had just been sitting there. But there was no one, no sign of movement. And yet I could feel it. The weight of something unseen, watching, waiting. "James," the voice said. The voice said my name, right next to me. I gasped, turning sharply. Nothing, just the empty hallway stretching behind me. My hands shook as I tried to steady my breathing. It wasn't possible. I was alone. I had to be alone. I stepped into the dining room slowly, carefully, my eyes darting to every shadowed corner. The chandelier above swayed slightly as if someone had just brushed past it. I swallowed. "Who's there?" My voice was barely above a whisper. The house seemed to inhale, the silence pressing against my ears. A scraping noise, wood against wood. My gaze snapped to the chair at the far end of the table. It moved just an inch. I saw it. My muscles tensed. I took a slow step backward, my body on high alert. Then the chair slid out further, this time with force, slamming against the floor. The sound echoed through the house. My breath hitched. I turned on my heel and hurried back toward the hallway, but before I could reach it, footsteps, fast, coming toward me. I stopped, my entire body locking up. The sound came from the hallway, from where I had just been. Heavy, urgent footsteps, like someone running straight at me. I braced myself, heart pounding against my ribs, but nothing came. The footsteps stopped just before reaching the doorway. Silence. Then slow, deliberate steps, moving in a circle just outside the room. My pulse roared in my ears. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to move. I wouldn't run, not yet. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I took another step back, my back nearly pressing against the wall. "I know you're there," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The footsteps stopped. Silence again. Then a whisper. "James," the voice said, drawing out my name like it was savoring the sound. It was closer now, just past the threshold of the dining room. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then something shifted. A shadow, barely perceptible, just beyond the doorway. I had to get out, now. I took a deep breath and lunged forward. As soon as I did, the footsteps erupted into a sprint. I bolted down the hallway, the sound of rushing steps matching mine. I didn't dare look back. I reached the stairs and took them two at a time, nearly tripping over myself in my panic. The footsteps followed, relentless. I burst into the upstairs hallway, slamming the door to the nearest room behind me. Silence. I pressed my back against the door, my chest heaving. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing. My fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob, twisting it just slightly. Locked. Had I locked it? I didn't remember. Then scratching. It started softly, barely audible at first. Nails dragging against wood. Slow, deliberate, right outside the door. I squeezed my eyes shut. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The scratching stopped. The silence stretched. Then the voice spoke again, directly on the other side of the door. "Let me in," the voice said. My blood ran cold. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My back was pressed against the door, my fingers gripping the knob so tightly my knuckles turned white. The silence on the other side was suffocating. "Let me in," the voice said. "No." I shook my head, though no one could see me. My mind screamed at me to do something, run, hide, escape, but my body refused to cooperate. I was frozen, locked in place by the sheer weight of terror pressing down on my chest. Then the doorknob twisted. At first it was a slight rattle, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was testing it. Then it became more forceful, a sharp jerk. I gasped and pressed my shoulder against the wood, bracing against it. The knob twisted again, harder this time. My breath came in quick, uneven bursts. And then silence. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. No movement, no sounds. The house was as still as death. I almost hoped it was over. Then a violent slam hit the door, making the entire frame shake. The walls trembled. "Let me in," the voice said. Another hit, harder this time. The wood groaned, splintering slightly near the hinges. Whatever was on the other side wasn't trying to open the door anymore. It was trying to break it down. I scrambled back, my mind racing for a plan. There was no way out. The window was too high. No furniture was nearby to barricade the door. My only option was to run. But where? The pounding stopped. The sudden absence of sound was almost worse. I stood there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my ears straining for any hint of movement. Nothing, just silence. Then the door unlocked itself. I stared, unable to process what I had just heard. The lock had twisted open on its own. I took a shaky step back, my eyes locked on the doorknob. It didn't move. The door didn't creak open. Nothing, it just sat there, waiting. Waiting for me to make a choice. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't going to open it. I turned toward the window. Maybe I could. The door opened slightly. Only an inch, then two. A sliver of darkness beyond the frame stretched into the hallway. My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a step back, then another. My heel hit the wall. The door stopped moving. For a moment, nothing happened. The gap remained, a dark void leading into the unknown. Then a hand appeared. Pale fingers curled around the edge of the door frame, gripping it lightly. My heart nearly stopped. The hand was wrong. The fingers were too long, too thin. The knuckles jutted out sharply, the skin stretched too tight over the bones. It didn't move, just held onto the edge like it was waiting for something. Then the fingers twitched. I bolted. I didn't think, didn't plan, just ran. I tore across the room, yanked open the closet door, and threw myself inside, shutting it behind me. Darkness swallowed me whole. I pressed a hand over my mouth, struggling to quiet my breathing. The closet was small, barely big enough for me to crouch in. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old boxes and forgotten clothes. My heart hammered against my ribs. And then I heard footsteps. Soft, slow, moving into the room. I squeezed my eyes shut. It was inside. The footsteps paused. Silence. Then movement. A slow, deliberate drag of fabric against wood, like someone or something was running their fingers along the furniture. My lungs burned. I needed to breathe, but I didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps moved again, closer. Then they stopped right outside the closet. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. The air felt thick, suffocating. I could feel its presence just beyond the door, standing there, listening. Then a whisper. "I know you're in there," the voice said. I clenched my fists, willing myself not to react. Silence. Then a single knock came against the closet door. I couldn't do this. I had to get out. But if I moved, if I made a single sound. The knob turned. Panic surged through me. I braced myself, my entire body coiled like a spring. The door didn't open all the way, just a crack, just enough for the air to shift, for the shadows to move. I didn't dare look. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps retreated. Slow, deliberate steps moved away from the closet, crossing the room, heading toward the door. And then silence. I waited, 5 seconds, 10. My breath came in short, uneven gasps. My muscles ached from how tightly I was curled up. Slowly, I reached out, pressing my fingers against the door. I pushed it open just an inch, then 2. The room was empty. The door to the hallway stood wide open. I swallowed hard. I had to leave, now. I stepped out cautiously, my legs trembling beneath me. Every instinct told me to run, but as I moved toward the door, something caught my eye. A single piece of paper rested on the desk. I hesitated. My fingers twitched at my sides. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't even want to be near it, but something about it felt important. Slowly, I reached out and picked it up. There was only one thing written on it. You were never alone. My hands shook, my vision blurred. The words burned into my mind. Then from somewhere deep within the house, the voice laughed. I stood there in the dim light, staring at the paper in my hand. The words burned into my mind. You were never alone. The voice echoed in the back of my mind, a sinister reminder that it was still with me, still watching. It was as if the house itself was alive, every creak and moan of the floorboards a warning, every whisper a reminder that I couldn't escape. The paper crinkled in my grip and my knuckles turned white as I clenched it tighter. I could still hear the faint laughter in the distance, like a cruel joke being played on me. My breath caught in my throat and I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just keep running from this. I couldn't let the voice win. As I took a step toward the door, the feeling of being watched intensified. My eyes darted around the room, my mind racing. The house felt different now, more alive, more oppressive. It wasn't just the voice anymore. It was the way the air seemed to shift, the way the shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, like they were reaching for me. I paused at the doorway, torn between fear and the urge to leave. I could hear the distant sound of the voice still echoing through the house, but it wasn't just words anymore. It was something else, a command, a pull, something urging me to stay, to face whatever was waiting for me. You can't run forever, the voice said, soft and patient. You're already too far in. You think you can just walk away now. I flinched at the words, but they didn't send me into a panic like before. They were just words, empty threats. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first stepped foot into this house. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was done running. I'm not running, I said, my voice shaking, but there was resolve behind it. I'm not afraid of you. The voice chuckled, a low, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. You should be, it whispered. You should be. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house seemed to stretch out before me, endless and labyrinthine. But I wasn't going to let the voice scare me back into hiding. I couldn't. I had to face whatever was waiting for me, or else I'd be trapped in this cycle forever. The door at the end of the hallway creaked open on its own, and I froze. For a moment I considered turning back, but then the voice spoke again, softer this time, almost coaxing. You're not afraid, the voice said, but you should be. You're not ready for what's in there. I swallowed hard, the words twisting in my gut. Was I ready? I wasn't sure, but I knew that I couldn't keep running. If I didn't face whatever was in this house, it would follow me forever. I had to confront it, confront whatever piece of myself had brought me back here in the first place. I stepped forward, my hand shaking as I reached for the door. The voice fell silent, but the tension in the air was palpable. I could feel it watching me, waiting. And then, as if sensing my hesitation, the voice returned, but it wasn't mocking this time. It was almost calm. You think you're in control, don't you? The voice said, its tone laced with something almost pitying. You think you can walk through this house and face whatever, waiting for you. But you're wrong. You'll never be in control here. I pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, but there was something familiar about it. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor littered with forgotten memories. And in the center of the room, an old rocking chair creaked back and forth, though there was no one sitting in it. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped further inside, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air felt thick with something I couldn't place, something heavy. The voice was quieter now, but its presence was still felt, like a dark cloud hanging over me, waiting to descend. I moved cautiously, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that something was about to happen. But there was nothing. Just the chair rocking, the soft creaking sound like a lullaby for the damned. Then I heard it again, the voice. I told you, it said, its tone low and final. You can't escape. The words felt like a weight pressing down on me, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. I wasn't running anymore. I was here and I was going to face this, whatever this was. I walked toward the rocking chair, the sound of it creaking louder with each step. The voice was still with me, but I was no longer afraid. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was standing here in the heart of the house, facing whatever it was that had haunted me for so long. And then in the stillness of the room, the chair stopped rocking. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The room was silent. Then slowly, the chair began to rock again. But this time, it wasn't moving on its own. Something was in it, something was there. The chair creaked again, but it wasn't the same rhythmic motion as before. This time, there was a weight to it, a heaviness that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I could feel the presence in the room shift, like the air itself was thickening. A coldness settled over me, and I instinctively took a step back, my heart racing. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch, reaching out toward me like fingers crawling across the floor. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was there. Something was watching me, and it wasn't the voice. It was something else, something older and darker. The rocking stopped. For a moment, I stood in the silence, trying to steady my breath. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, and every inch of space was occupied by the presence I couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of my being. It was suffocating. Then the voice came again, this time softer, almost like a whisper from behind me. You can't hide from me, it said. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the same dim light filtering through the cracks in the curtains. The shadows moved unnaturally, bending in ways they shouldn't have, as if they were alive, responding to the voice. I could hear its breath, slow and deliberate, coming from all directions at once. I gripped the edge of the wall, my fingers trembling. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, but I knew it wasn't just the voice anymore. It was something more, something ancient and malevolent, an entity that didn't belong in this world. I had made a mistake coming here, but there was no turning back now. I had to see this through. I had to confront whatever was waiting for me. Don't turn around, the voice said, its tone deep and smooth. You don't want to see it, trust me. But I was already turning, already facing whatever was behind me, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing in the far corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the dimness that surrounded me. But then I saw its shape more clearly, its outline sharp and angular, like a silhouette too sharp to belong in the room. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated in a way that made my stomach churn. I could see no features, no face, just the dark outline of something that should not have existed. The air grew heavier as I stood there, frozen in place, unable to look away. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, staring at me, or at least I assumed it was staring. I couldn't see its eyes, couldn't see anything beyond the oppressive darkness that consumed it, but I could feel its gaze as if it were burning into my very soul. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, but the words escaped before I could stop them. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move. Slowly at first, like it was testing the air, then faster, more deliberate. It took one step, then another, its movements jerky, unnatural. The room seemed to bend around it, the walls twisting and shifting as if they couldn't contain it. I didn't know whether to run or to stand my ground, but the decision was made for me as the figure began to cross the room toward me. "You can't escape it," the voice said again, its tone darker now, almost smug. "You've gone too far." I took a step back, but the figure was already closer. Its presence grew with each passing second, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The only thing I could do was watch, paralyzed as it advanced. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a presence, something alive, something real. I could feel it. Every bone in my body screamed at me to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. The figure reached out, its long, thin arms stretching toward me. I could hear the faint scrape of its fingers against the floor, a sound like nails on a chalkboard. Then its hand touched mine. I gasped, the coldness of its touch seeping through my skin. It was like ice, like death itself had wrapped its fingers around my own. I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't respond. The voice laughed again, its sound like thunder in the distance. "You should have listened," the voice said, its tone full of satisfaction. But as the figure's grip tightened, something changed. The darkness that surrounded it began to unravel. The shadows seemed to recoil, pulling back from the figure like it was being forced out of the room. The air, once thick and suffocating, began to feel lighter, as if something was breaking. The figure jerked back, as if it were caught in a struggle, its hand loosening around mine. "No," the voice said, its tone now tinged with panic. "You can't." The figure stumbled backward, its shape flickering, like it was losing its hold on the world. It began to fade, slowly, as if it were being pulled away, dragged back into whatever darkness it had come from. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, but I could feel the tension in the air crack, as if something long forgotten was slipping away. And then, just like that, it was gone. The room was empty again. I stood there, still frozen in place, my mind racing. My heart pounded in my chest and my breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. The house was no longer just haunted by the voice. There was something far worse lurking in the shadows, something that didn't belong here. And I had just seen it. That thing, the presence. Whatever it was real and it had touched me. I took a shaky step back, then another, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The coldness that lingered on my skin, the fear that gripped my chest, it was too much. I couldn't stay in this room any longer. I didn't know what the hell that thing was or why it had appeared, but I needed to get out. The house felt different now, as if the air itself had shifted. The weight of the presence had lifted, but the emptiness left behind felt like it was closing in around me. I stepped cautiously toward the door, my mind racing. Every part of me screamed to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house was no longer just haunted by a voice. There was something worse lurking, something far more dangerous. I placed my hand on the doorknob, my fingers trembling. The silence around me was deafening, but in the back of my mind, I heard the voice again, faint and distant, like an echo from another place. "You can't escape," it whispered. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know if it was just in my head, but I couldn't ignore it. It had said the same thing over and over, but now it felt different, stronger, more real. I had to get out of this house. The farther I got from it, the better. I threw the door open and stepped into the hallway, the cold wood of the floor creaking beneath my feet. The house stretched out in front of me, dark and endless. My footsteps were the only sound in the silence, but I could still feel it, the presence. It was out there somewhere, watching me. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know how to escape. The house was like a maze, every corner and hallway leading to another dead end. But I had to keep moving. I turned left, heading down the hall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in, the air growing heavier. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears, but every time I thought I was getting away, I could feel the presence at my back, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I glanced over my shoulder. The hallway stretched out in both directions, dark and oppressive. No sign of anyone or anything. But then there was a sound. A soft, unmistakable scraping noise, like something or someone dragging itself across the floor. I spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, silent hallway stretching on and on. But I knew, I could feel it. It was close. It was following me. I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the floor as I sprinted down the hallway. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get away. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating, but I pushed forward, desperate for escape. Then, as I turned a corner, I skidded to a stop. The hallway opened up into a large, grand foyer. The front door was just ahead, bathed in a sliver of moonlight that filtered through the cracked windows. I could see the outside world beyond it, freedom. I ran toward the door, my hands reaching for the handle. But just as I touched the cold brass, the door slammed shut. I pulled back, stunned. I looked at the door, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? I reached for the handle again, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked, bolted from the inside. "Why won't you leave?" the voice said, its tone mocking, taunting. My stomach dropped. It was here in the room with me now. I turned around, panic rising in my chest. The shadows in the corner of the room began to shift, moving like they were alive. The presence that had followed me was here, pressing down on me from all sides. I had no choice. There was no way out. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to just stand there and wait to be taken. The voice continued, its words cutting through the air like a knife. "You cannot escape. This place has you now." I clenched my fists, heart hammering. There was no running, no hiding, but there was one thing I could do. I wasn't going down without a fight. I turned, facing the shadows, my body tense. The presence wasn't just following me anymore. It was in the room with me, and I wasn't going to let it win. The air around me felt thick with tension, as if the shadows themselves were alive, creeping toward me, closing in on all sides. I could feel the presence in the room, the weight of it pressing down on me like the walls were closing in. The door behind me, locked and impenetrable, was a distant memory now. There was no escape. I had to face this thing. Whatever it was, it wanted something from me. And if I didn't act, I was going to end up just another forgotten soul in this godforsaken house. The voice spoke again, its tone dripping with malicious pleasure. "You think you can fight me?" it sneered. "You're already mine." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum beat, every thud shaking my entire body. I could feel the coldness that had followed me, growing colder with every passing second. I turned, looking for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. My eyes scanned the room, landing on an old fireplace poker resting near the hearth. It was rusty, heavy, and seemed like my only option. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I wrapped them around the cold metal. The weight of it felt reassuring in my hands, a small sense of control in the chaos that surrounded me. I raised it in front of me, ready for whatever came next. The shadows moved again, twisting and contorting, becoming shapes and figures that had no place in the world of the living. I could hear faint whispers, soft voices barely audible, like the wind itself was speaking in some forgotten language. I took a step back, my grip tightening around the poker, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice laughed again, louder now, echoing in my ears. "You're not getting away," it taunted. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Every instinct told me to run, to find another way out, but I knew there was no running anymore. Not from this. The shadows stretched toward me, reaching out with long, skeletal fingers. I swung the poker, the sound of metal striking air, but it did nothing. The shadows recoiled for just a second, as if my movement had startled them. Then they came again. I swung again, harder this time. The poker connected with something, but there was no satisfaction in the hit. It wasn't flesh. It wasn't solid. It felt like I was swinging at smoke, at nothing. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't give up. If I did, it would all be over. "You think you can fight the inevitable," the voice said, its tone growing darker. "I am part of this place. I am its heart." I gritted my teeth. The voice was right in one sense. This house had a hold on me now, but I wasn't going to let it claim me without a fight. I swung the poker again, this time aiming at the center of the shadows. The darkness swirled, avoiding the strike with unnatural speed, but I didn't stop. I kept swinging, my arms growing tired, my movement slower. The weight of the shadows was too much. It felt like the entire room was pressing against me, like it was suffocating me. "You're not strong enough," the voice said, mocking. "I was here before you. I will remain long after." I was running out of time. My strength was waning. I could feel it, my legs shaking beneath me, my arms growing heavy. The shadows moved faster now, swirling around me like a storm. The air was cold, suffocating, and no matter how hard I tried to fight, the darkness was relentless. Then, just as I thought I couldn't go on any longer, something shifted. The poker caught on something solid. A wall, perhaps, a barrier hidden in the darkness that I couldn't see. But it was real. It was there. The shadows recoiled for a brief moment, pulling away from me. And in that moment of clarity, I felt it. The pulse of something older than this house. Something ancient and powerful. It was like a crack in the darkness. A weakness I hadn't noticed before. I had no idea what it was, but it was the only thing that had worked so far. The voice faltered, a hiss escaping from the darkness. "No, no, Yuka." I didn't know how long I had before it came back, before the darkness swallowed me whole again, but I knew I had to act. I had to find the source of this power, before the house closed in on me once again. With renewed determination, I stepped forward, poker in hand, pushing through the swirling shadows. The voice screamed in fury, the sound rising around me like a hurricane, but I didn't stop. I had to keep moving, keep searching. There was something here, something that could end this. I didn't know if I would find it in time, but I couldn't let fear control me anymore. Not now. Not when I could feel the house itself trembling beneath my feet. The hunt was far from over. The house seemed to groan, its very foundations shaking with the presence of something ancient, something alive. The shadows were everywhere, twisting and writhing like serpents, but the more I pushed forward, the more the poker seemed to gain weight, like it was pulling me toward something hidden deep within the house. I could feel the air around me grow colder, thicker, and more oppressive. Every step felt like I was wading through water, but the deeper I went, the closer I seemed to be to whatever had been calling to me from the shadows. I gritted my teeth and kept moving, the poker raised before me, ready for whatever came next. "You really think you can stop this?" the voice said, its tone dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but a child, lost in a game you can't win." I didn't reply. I couldn't. The words stung, but they didn't matter. Not now. All I cared about was ending this, finding out why the house was this way, and what part I played in all of it. I rounded a corner and the world seemed to shift. The floor beneath me creaked, but there was something else now, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the long hallway. The voice's laughter followed me, like it was all around me, crawling under my skin. "I'm not running from you anymore," I muttered to myself, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The words felt hollow, lost in the vastness of the house. But I couldn't show fear. Not now, not when I was so close. The footsteps grew louder and I turned sharply, ready for whatever came. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway in the dim light, something stood. A figure. Tall, thin, its features obscured by the darkness that seemed to gather around it, bending the light itself. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly, twin points of cold blue light that seemed to pierce the air, locking onto me with unnerving focus. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, pulling at me like gravity, dragging me toward it. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. This was the thing, the source of everything, the force behind the voice, behind the shadows, behind the feeling that I wasn't alone in this house. The air felt like it was closing in on me, suffocating me, but I couldn't turn away. Not now, not when I was this close to the truth. "You still think you can stop this?" the voice said, now coming from all directions, the words twisting through the air like smoke. It laughed, low and cruel, as the figure stepped forward, its long limbs extending with unnatural fluidity. The floor beneath it seemed to warp and bend with each step it took, as if the very foundation of the house was bowing to its will. I lifted the poker, my knuckles white from the force I was gripping it with, but my hand was shaking. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop it from coming closer, from swallowing me whole. But then something shifted. The air itself seemed to tremble, like a wave was crashing against the walls of the house. The shadows that had been lurking in every corner began to retreat, pulling back from the figure. The figure faltered for a moment, its form flickering like a faulty television screen. The voice screeched in fury. "No, you can't, I won't allow it." But it was too late. The light around me seemed to brighten for a moment, like the house was breathing. The oppressive weight in the air lightened, just for a second, as if the very essence of the house was being pushed back. I took a step forward, the poker held tightly in my grip, ready to strike. My heart pounded in my chest, but I had never felt more alive, more determined. The thing, the voice, the entity behind it all couldn't win. Not now. The figure stumbled back, its form flickering again, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. The shadows recoiled further as if they were afraid of something. I didn't know what was happening, but I didn't care. I took another step, this time with purpose, and the figure seemed to shrink, its form fading like smoke in the wind. The shadows retreated, fading into the cracks of the house as if they had never been there at all. And then, for the first time since I'd set foot in this hellish place, the house went quiet. No voice, no laughter, no footsteps. Just silence. I stood there panting, my grip still tight around the poker. The darkness was still there lurking, but it felt different, lighter, less suffocating. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time I felt like I was in control. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing: I had won. For now. But something told me the house wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. I stood in the middle of the hallway, the silence pressing down on me like an overwhelming weight. The poker still gripped in my hand, though my arm ached from holding it so tightly. My breath came in short bursts and my mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The shadows had retreated, but I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The house, for all its eerie quiet, felt different now. Lighter, as if something had shifted within it. The oppressive air that had been suffocating me before had faded, and the shadows seemed less alive, less eager to move. I could still feel them lurking in the corners, but they no longer had the same hold over me. I hesitated for a moment, considering my next move. The figure, whatever it was, had vanished, but it wasn't the end. The voice was still here somewhere. It had to be. "You can't run forever," the voice said, its tone dripping with malice, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I froze. It was back. But something felt different. The voice didn't sound as certain this time. It had lost some of its power, its overwhelming force. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving forward. "You think you've won," the voice continued, its laughter echoing through the hall. "You haven't even begun to understand what's going on here." I swallowed hard, trying to push the fear down, but it was difficult. The voice had a way of worming into my mind, planting doubt where there had been none. But I couldn't afford to listen anymore. I wasn't going to let it control me, not again. I looked down the hallway, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness stretching out from every corner, pulling at me. But there was something else that didn't belong. A door. It stood at the far end of the hall, the only door I hadn't explored yet. It was slightly ajar, an eerie, cold light spilling from the crack. The shadows didn't dare approach it, as if whatever was beyond that door was too much, even for them. I took a deep breath and started walking toward it, the poker still clutched in my hand. My footsteps echoed through the empty house, each one feeling heavier than the last. As I approached the door, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The air felt charged, like static before a storm. The voice, still present, still swirling around me, grew louder, angrier. "Don't you dare go in there," it warned, the words sharp and cutting. "You'll regret it." But I didn't stop. I couldn't. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for, the moment I would confront whatever was left of the house's twisted, broken soul. I pushed the door open. The light inside was blinding at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A room, plain, almost barren except for one thing, a large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. The frame was old, cracked, like it had been there for centuries. The glass itself was smooth, untouched by time, and yet something about it made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me. The air here was different, cooler, almost sterile. I approached the mirror slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. As I got closer, I could see my reflection, but there was something wrong with it. The edges of my reflection blurred, like the glass was trying to reject me, to distort me. And then, it happened. A figure appeared behind me in the mirror. I whipped around, but there was nothing. Just the empty room, just the door I had come through. But in the mirror, the figure was still there. I couldn't make out the details of it, only that it was tall, shadowed, and very much not human. The reflection moved slowly, deliberately, reaching out toward me. The voice laughed again, but this time it was quieter, more distant. "You found it," the voice said, a hint of satisfaction in its tone. "The heart of it all." I stumbled back, my chest tightening. The figure in the mirror was closer now, its fingers stretching toward me, its cold, empty eyes locking onto mine. I could feel the chill radiating from it, even though I wasn't touching the glass. But I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen, locked in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the reflection. And then the figure spoke. "You're not getting out," it said, its voice a low rasp, barely audible. "Not until it's done." The words made no sense, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. What did it mean? What wasn't done? Before I could process it, the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The figure's hand pressed flat against the glass, and I felt a pull, as if something was trying to drag me in. I reached out, my hand trembling, wanting to touch the mirror, to see if it was real, if anything in this house was real. But the moment my fingers brushed against the surface, everything went dark. I opened my eyes, but the world around me was no longer the same. It wasn't the dimly lit hallway I had been standing in just moments ago. Instead, I found myself in a place that felt completely alien, a place of infinite shadows. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and the distant, eerie sound of whispers filled the space. I tried to move, but my body felt sluggish, as if gravity had intensified, making every step a struggle. The mirror, the thing that had pulled me in, was gone. There was no trace of it, nothing but the endless blackness stretching around me. I tried to call out, but no sound came. My throat was dry, constricted. My mind raced, wondering if I was dreaming or if this was some twisted version of reality that I had fallen into. Had I crossed into another world, another dimension? Was this the end? "Where are you?" the voice said, distant but unmistakable. It echoed around me, its tone dripping with a cruel, mocking amusement. "Did you think you could escape?" I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but the darkness was everywhere, swallowing everything. I couldn't see anything, couldn't feel anything familiar. It was as if I had been pulled into the very heart of the house, into a place it didn't want me to be. The air grew colder and I could see my breath in front of me, misting in the freezing temperature. It felt unnatural, wrong. The chills seemed to come from every direction at once, surrounding me, creeping into my bones. "You're trapped now," the voice said again, this time much closer, a low growl in my ear that made my spine tingle with terror. "You've walked into my domain and you won't leave." I swallowed hard, trying to force back the panic rising within me. The last thing I wanted to do was show weakness, but everything within me screamed to run, to escape, to find a way out of this place. But there was no escape, no obvious path forward. Just the darkness, the suffocating blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against my cheek. I jerked back, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around, but I couldn't see anything. No figure, no shape, just the emptiness. "You can't hide from me," the voice whispered, so close now that it felt like it was coming from inside my head. "I know what you're thinking." I staggered back, feeling the cold floor beneath me. I needed to stay calm, needed to think my way out of this. But how? How could I fight something I couldn't see? Something that knew my every thought? The floor beneath me seemed to shift, as if it was moving, bending in unnatural ways. My foot slipped, and I nearly lost my balance, but I caught myself just in time. I needed to keep moving. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stand still. The darkness, the voice, it was closing in on me. I could feel it, like the walls were closing in, like the space around me was tightening, pushing me into a smaller, more suffocating space. I forced myself to move forward, even though every instinct told me to turn back, to flee from the voice that had haunted me for so long. But this was different. The house had changed. It wasn't just the voice anymore. It was something worse, something that had been lying in wait for me. I took a step, then another. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, suffocating me with its mocking tone. "You can't outrun me," the voice said, its words dripping with contempt. "I am the house. I am everything here." Suddenly, the ground beneath me buckled and I fell to my knees, my hands scraping against the cold, uneven surface. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole, and I couldn't tell if I was moving or if the world was shifting around me. It was like being caught in a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see blood, but there was nothing. Just darkness. My fingers trembled, my chest heaving with each desperate breath. "You can't keep running," the voice repeated, its mocking tone never leaving. "It's too late for you." I tried to stand, but the darkness pressed in on me, weighing me down. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as if the house was alive, swallowing me, suffocating me, pulling me into its depths. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, there was a light, a small, flickering light in the distance. A doorway. I stumbled toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice, still echoing around me, seemed to grow quieter as I moved forward, but I didn't care. I had to get out of here. I had to escape. I reached the door, but as I stepped through, the world changed again. The light vanished, replaced by more darkness. The suffocating presence returned. The voice laughed, its sound echoing through the void. "You think you've escaped," the voice said, "but this is where it all begins." I stumbled through the door, and for a moment I thought I was free. The darkness that had surrounded me seemed to lift, and for the briefest of moments, the air felt different, lighter, like I could breathe again. But just as quickly, that fleeting sense of relief vanished. I was no longer in the house, or at least I didn't think I was. The room around me was unfamiliar, and yet it felt like a place I had been before. The walls were bare, the floor cold and smooth beneath my feet. No shadows, no voices, just silence. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of it all. My head was spinning and my chest felt tight, like I couldn't quite catch my breath. But I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop now. I turned, my eyes scanning the room, searching for something, anything, that might help me understand what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the empty space, stretching out in every direction. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, like a rustling in the distance. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew what it was. The voice. "You think you're free," the voice said, its tone dripping with amusement. "But this place, it's not what you think." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that voice. It was the same voice, the one that had been with me since the beginning, that had haunted my every step. It had followed me here, followed me into whatever this place was. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "No, you're not real." The voice laughed again, the sound echoing around me, as if it were coming from all directions at once. "I've always been real," the voice said. "I've always been here waiting for you." I gritted my teeth, trying to ignore the fear rising in my chest. I had to stay focused. I had to push forward. I turned away from the voice, determined not to let it control me anymore. I didn't know where I was, but I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out. The room seemed to stretch on forever. I walked, my footsteps slow and cautious, each one echoing in the stillness. The walls were so high, so oppressive, that I couldn't see the end. It was like walking in a never-ending tunnel. Then in the distance I saw it, a door, a way out. Without hesitation, I ran toward it, my feet pounding against the cold floor. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, as if the voice were trying to stop me. But I wouldn't let it. I couldn't let it. I reached the door and threw it open. I stepped through, and the moment I did, everything changed. The world around me was no longer dark, no longer suffocating. I stood in a wide-open field, the sun shining down, the air fresh and clean. The grass was green, the sky clear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. I looked around, disoriented, as the reality of the moment began to sink in. It felt like I had been here before, like this was the world I had been trying to reach. And then I heard it again, the voice. But this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, clearer. "You think you're free?" the voice asked, its tone dripping with malice. "You're not free, James. You never will be." I turned, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one, nothing but the endless field around me. I realized then that the voice wasn't just in the house. It was inside me, a part of me, a part of this world. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, it would always be there, waiting. I was trapped, not in a house, not in a place, but in my own mind. And as the sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows across the field, I understood the truth. The voice had never been trying to hurt me. It had been trying to show me something, something I hadn't been ready to face. I wasn't running from the house. I was running from myself. I stood there in the middle of the vast, empty field, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I had just realized. The sun had set completely now, and the sky above me was filled with stars. They twinkled softly, their quiet presence a stark contrast to the chaos I had just lived through. I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, but somehow I felt lighter. Not completely free, but closer to it. The voice no longer whispered. It didn't laugh. It simply waited. "You know," the voice said, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. "This could all end, you know. You could stop running." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The voice was still there, still so much a part of me. But its words, there was no malice now, no threat. Just a calm certainty that resonated deep within me. "I'm not running anymore," I said aloud, my voice steady, though the truth of it scared me. I wasn't running from the house anymore, and I wasn't running from myself either. The ground beneath me felt solid, steady. It was the first time I had felt this way since I'd walked into that cursed house, since I had encountered the voice for the first time. Everything about this world, about my life, had been twisted, distorted by fear, and by what I had believed was chasing me. But now I understood. The shadows weren't my enemy. The darkness wasn't something to be feared. It was me, and in facing it, I was learning to accept it. For the first time in years, I let out a breath, deep and steady. The voice had been a part of me, yes, but it had only been trying to show me that I had the power to change, to grow, to stop running from the parts of myself I hated and embrace them instead. The stars above me shimmered, distant and cold, but somehow comforting. And in that moment I realized something. The house, the voice, the endless running, they weren't real. They had been a manifestation of everything I feared, everything I had avoided. But now, standing here in this field, I was free. Free to stop running from myself. And the voice, it was still there, but it no longer held power over me. It was no longer a threat. It was simply a reminder of how far I had come. "I'm not afraid anymore," I whispered, feeling the weight of those words, feeling the truth in them settle into the deepest parts of me. And just like that, the voice fell silent. It didn't laugh, it didn't speak. It simply ceased. The air around me was calm now, a peaceful stillness settling over the land. The field, the sky, the stars, everything felt at peace. I was at peace. I turned and began walking, no longer looking over my shoulder, no longer afraid of what might be behind me. The world stretched out before me, wide and open, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had finally found the freedom I had been searching for. And I knew deep down that no matter where I went from here, the voice wouldn't be chasing me. It had been a part of me all along, but now I had left it behind. The journey was over, and in the quiet that followed, I knew I was truly free.